All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get ourselves started for this morning? And it is Monday. Yeah, you can tell it's Monday. It is May 4th, 2020. This is Political Science 130672. My name is Paul Savoy. This is our regularly scheduled weekly Zoom meeting. And today, two main things that we want to accomplish. First thing, of course, is for me to go ahead and take any questions that you have about the topic that you are learning about right now, and specifically the discussion forum post assignment that you are working on right now that is due this coming Wednesday at 11:59 p.m., not counting the grace period, of course, and that is dealing with the U.S. Congress. So if you recall, last week we talked a fair bit. I kind of previewed the notes on the U.S. Congress, the class notes that I have for you on Canvas. And hopefully, since then, you've been at least starting to work on taking a look at the required videos as well as the assigned reading for Congress. And so I'll be happy to deal with any questions that you have about that subject first off. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time today introducing and previewing the class notes that I put up on Canvas for you this morning, dealing with our next topic, that is the second of the three national government branches that the framers created in Article 2 of the Constitution. So we'll talk a little bit about the presidency and go over some of the highlights of those notes. And so that's pretty much what we have going on today. Of course, a couple of reminders. As always, this weekly meeting is being recorded so that you can either watch this after the fact, or if you want to go back and rewatch any section of this meeting this morning, you can go ahead and do so. And so to review any past recording of a meeting, all you have to do is click on the ConferZoom link in the left-hand menu of our Canvas homepage, and then click on where it says recordings, and then click on the link for the date of the meeting that you wish to watch. And you may or may not, it depends on Canvas. Canvas has been kind of weird lately. You may or may not, when you click on that meeting link, be prompted to put in a password. If you are, then use the password that you used to get into this meeting today, the one that I have listed for you in my Canvas announcement from last Friday. And you should have no trouble accessing that recording. Also, just a couple of reminders. Dealing with other aspects of the class. If you need to contact me at any time during the week, a number of ways that you can do that. You can always feel free to send me an email or a Canvas message. You can also join me one-on-one during my virtual student hours on Zoom. Those happen every Monday and Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 until 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. So we'll be doing it again this afternoon. And if you want to talk to me about anything having to do with the class or anything that you think that I can assist you with, please feel free to join during those virtual student hours. And the Zoom link and password that you need to join those virtual student hours is found on our Canvas homepage. If you scroll down our homepage, down past the picture, go down to the section labeled Basic Course Information, and you will see both the link and the password for those weekly Canvas virtual, or those weekly Zoom-based virtual student hours. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention before we went ahead and got going for this morning, our second test of the semester, test number 2, was due technically last Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day or 72-hour grace period tacked on after that. And I will, for those of you that have turned in test number 2, I will be going ahead and working on grading those over the next couple of days. So be looking for those scores on Canvas in a couple of days. But if you have not yet turned in test number 2 for whatever reason, please do send me a Canvas message or an email as soon as possible, or visit me during my virtual student hours, and let's figure out a solution. I understand this semester, more than any other, schedules are ever changing. Things are crazy. Life is just not what we're used to. And so if you've not yet been able to turn in test number 2, please let me know. Let's talk about it. let's work out a solution, because obviously my number one goal in this class is to do everything that I possibly can to help you be successful in this class and successful in just getting through this weird period in our lives and moving forward into the future. So please don't hesitate to talk to me about that or any issue that that you think I might be able to help you with. All right. And so finally, if you have any questions or comments at any point during our meeting this morning, always please feel free to unmute your microphone, ask your question, or make your comment. Or if you'd rather, just go ahead and put your question or comment in the group chat, and I will acknowledge it and deal with it as well. So before we get started talking about any questions that you might have about the U.S. Congress, are there any questions, comments, problems, complaints, anything having to do with the class in general? Anything at all before we go ahead and get ourselves started for this morning? Anybody? Okay, so why don't we go ahead and move on? And as I said, if you were on this broadcast last week, after I went ahead and talked a little bit about the test, went over the logistics and the process of test number 2, that sort of thing, I went ahead and gave you kind of a broad overview of, first of all, the main topic that we were going to be working on in this class this week and the next couple of weeks after that. And that is talking about the 3 national government branches. And if you recall, I talked about the fact that when the framers created our current Constitution back in 1787, that one of the big assumptions that they made as they were designing Congress, the presidency, and the courts, that is the folks who make laws, enforce laws, and interpret laws in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, that one of the fundamental assumptions that the framers were working from was that the 3 national government branches all needed to have roughly the same level of power and authority. That if we were going to try and create a national government that was strong enough to maintain order in society, but not so strong that it threatened the people's natural rights, then one branch could not be overpowering, could not dominate the other 2. And so we talked about that last week, but we also talked about the fact that today in 2020, the framers' assumption is no longer valid. That most people who study the U.S. political system agree that by far the president, the executive branch generally, is the most powerful and perhaps the most potentially dangerous of the 3 national government branches. And I asked you to keep that whole issue in mind over the next several weeks, especially this question of, is it possible that the framers, from their perspective in 1787, were correct in assuming that they needed to have 3 branches of roughly equal power and authority? But could it also be correct that the framers' assumption is no longer valid today in 2020? Can we make the argument that with all that there is going on in the world today, it is actually potentially a reasonable thing, a good thing, potentially a desirable thing for modern presidents to be a lot more powerful than Congress, or a lot more powerful than the courts? And that's kind of the main thing that I said sort of generally about the 3 national government branches last week. Now, the other thing that I did, of course, was I went over some of the highlights in the notes regarding the U.S. Congress. I emphasized the fact that, the framers, when they sat down to create Congress back in 1787 in Article 1 of the Constitution, that the framers had a very different perception of Congress than we do today. Remember what we said. We said last week that the framers believed that Congress had the greatest potential to become the most powerful and most dangerous of the 3 national government branches, that Congress would be the one potentially that had the greatest possibility of taking away, of threatening our natural rights and abusing your power and stuff like that. And I asked the question, well, how did we get from there to here? Because today, most Americans don't fear Congress. In fact, most Americans today argue that Congress is potentially the weakest and the least dangerous and perhaps the least competent of the three national government branches in the year 2020. And if you recall, we said last time that how we got from there to here was the fault of the framers. That the framers, because they had this overwhelming fear of Congress, were very careful as they designed the structure and function and process of Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, so much so that they made sure that Congress could not spin out of control, that Congress could not become too powerful, that Congress could not abuse its authority or threaten anyone's natural rights. And so they very carefully specified in Article 1 of the Constitution what Congress could and could not do. And as we said last week, the framers did a very effective job of limiting Congress, of boxing Congress in this way. In fact, we could argue probably that Congress did too good of a job of limiting Congress, limiting its power. And that's one of the main reasons why today in 2020 that we see Congress as being the most powerful and the most dangerous of the three national government branches. Now, the other main highlight of the Congress notes that I talked a little bit about last week, before we take any questions that you might have about Congress, is the fact that, as I said, if you looked at Section 4, the last section, the biggest section of the Congress notes that I gave you on Canvas, you'll notice that the framers, as they created Congress in Article 1, gave Congress a tremendous amount of stuff to do, that they gave Congress 6 major jobs that Congress was supposed to carry out on a regular basis. Now, the biggest and probably the most important of those jobs, of course, is the lawmaking function, because that's the main thing that Congress is known for. It's the legislative branch. It's responsible for making national government laws. But the framers also gave Congress 5 other very important tasks to carry out on a regular basis. And as we said last week, there is no way that members of Congress working 24/7, 365 could possibly carry out all 6 of those jobs with equal effectiveness all of the time. It was simply impossible then and now. The framers just gave Congress way too much to do. Now, because of that, members of Congress today, each member of Congress has to make a calculation. They have to decide, of those 6 jobs that they're given by the framers, that they're given by the Constitution, which of those 6 jobs are they going to focus on? Which of those 6 functions are they going to spend most of their time, energy, and effort carrying out? Because they can't do all 6 equally well all of the time. And the really important point that I highlighted for you last time was the fact that most all members of Congress make pretty much the same calculation when they are trying to prioritize which of their jobs they're going to carry out, as opposed to which of their jobs they're going to kind of push aside off into a corner and hope that nobody notices. And that is based on their reelection obsession. So in other words, as we talked about last week, members of Congress are going to spend most of their time and energy and effort carrying out those jobs that they believe give them the biggest potential reelection benefit. So they'll do those things that will help them win votes, that will help more potential American voters like them and support them on election day. On the other hand, those presidential functions that either don't help a member of Congress get reelected or that might actually hurt their reelection chances, those are the ones they kind of push off onto the side and hope that nobody notices. And as I said last week, that's kind of a mixed bag. That's good and bad for we the people, in the sense that some of the things that members of Congress do because it helps them get reelected, like the representative function that hopefully you've read about in the notes, or the constituent service function or something like that. Those do, or the public education function, all of those things provide Americans with real benefits. So we should be happy that members of Congress are carrying out those functions actively. However, there are other important things that members of Congress should be doing. A couple of examples from Section 4 of the notes: the oversight function and the conflict resolution function. Members of Congress, for the good of the country, should be working on those very hard, but they don't. Why? Because those functions most of the time either don't help them get reelected, or they might actually harm their reelection chances. So it's a real mixed bag. So that is pretty much what we said last week in highlighting some important aspects of the US Congress, both its structure, its function, and also its evolution. So as you are working on the discussion forum post assignment for Congress, which is due, of course, this Wednesday, May 6th at 11:59 p.m., you might all, and remember, the 3-day grace period also does apply to that assignment. So you have 3 additional days to submit it to me on Canvas for full credit. But as you're working on that, are there any questions that you have right now about any of the information that you are currently learning about regarding Congress? So any information contained in the class notes from Canvas, any information from the assigned readings that you're working on, or any information contained in the 2 or 3 crash course videos that I gave you for Congress. Any questions, comments, problems at all about anything having to do with Congress? Okay, so I'm told all good by those with me in the live version of this recording, so that's great. So what I'm going to do for the rest of our time together this morning then is to go ahead and preview, highlight some of the important stuff in the notes dealing with the next bit of information that you're going to be learning about, and that will feed into the next discussion forum post assignment that is due a week from this coming Wednesday. So that will be May 13th. And that is the discussion forum post and the notes and everything else dealing with the presidency. The folks that are, among other things, supposed to be enforcing national government laws. So if you've taken a look at our modules page on Canvas this morning, you'll notice that I've gone ahead and posted the class notes on the presidency. I opened up the presidency module, and the class notes for the presidency are there. I've also given you links to the 2 crash course videos on presidential power that I want you to look at over the next week or so. And I also went ahead and put up and opened up the discussion forum post on the presidency that is due upcoming on May 13th. So all of the information that you need for the presidency is up for you when you get to looking at it. So if you take a look at the presidency notes that I gave you on Canvas, you'll notice that the notes follow pretty much the exact same format as the notes that we were going over last week dealing with the US Congress. So I open up the notes on the presidency by talking about the framers' attitudes towards the presidency as they were creating the structure and function and process of the presidency, as well as the rest of the executive branch in Article 2 of the Constitution. I then talk in Section 2 of the notes, and we'll go over that in a bit more detail in a minute, by the way. I'm not just leaving it. But in Section 2 of the presidency notes, I talk a little bit about why it is that some presidents in the history of the United States are considered to be much more successful, much more effective. They are considered to be much better presidents than others that we've had in history. Because think about it, at this point, we've had 45 presidents of the United States, starting with George Washington in 1789 and going all the way to the current resident of the White House, Donald Trump, in 2020. And we'll look at probably one of the most important factors, one of the most real and authentic factors, I think, that help us explain over time why some of those 45 presidents have been so much more successful as president than others. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then most of the notes in the presidency, most of the stuff listed in the presidency notes talks about the five basic functions, the five major jobs that the framers themselves gave to the president when they created the presidency back in Article 2 of the Constitution. So that's the basic format for the presidency notes. So let me go back and talk in a little bit more detail, particularly about the information contained in section 1, Roman numeral number 1 of your presidency notes, as well as the information contained in Roman numeral number 2, and we'll go on from there. So here's the thing. Remember how we were saying that when the framers sat down to create Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, that the framers were really scared of Congress, that the framers thought, and we reviewed this a few minutes ago, that of all three national government branches, that Congress had the greatest potential to become the most powerful, the most dangerous, the most abusive of the three major parts of the national government. And that's why the framers really sweated the details as they put down the structure and function and process and powers of Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. That's why they tried to box Congress in as effectively as they did. Well, guess what? If you take a look at Roman numeral number 1 in the presidency notes from this morning, what you will notice is that the framers, as they sat down to create the structure and function and powers and process of the presidency, had a very different attitude towards the president and towards the executive branch in general. To be quite honest, the framers really did not fear the president. The framers really didn't think that there was a great likelihood of a president becoming too powerful, abusing that power, spinning out of control, and threatening the natural rights of the people. So the framers did not at all fear the presidency in the way that they feared the US Congress. And there are lots of different reasons that political scientists and constitutional historians and others give for this really different attitude that the framers had regarding the presidency than they did regarding Congress. But even today in 2020, and I guess I should probably say, especially today in the year 2020, you know, people hear this, that the framers just didn't think there was much possibility of Congress becoming overly powerful and spinning out of control. And they're really kind of shocked and surprised by that because, you know, for folks that have been living over the last 40 or 50, 60 years or so, we've seen a very different story from the president. You know, if you, when you go through and read the presidency notes in detail, you know, it says that presidents going all the way back to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, starting with FDR and going all the way up to the present day to our current president, Donald J. Trump, modern presidents have grown dramatically in power and authority. And really, since the 1970s with Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal, we've gotten to the point where today, where most Americans, as I've said previously, fear the president, that most Americans today feel that the president is by far the most powerful and the most potentially dangerous of the three national government branches. And so that leads us to ask about the presidency the same question that we talked about last week regarding Congress. And that is, how did we get from there to here? How do we get from the framers not really fearing the president, not really being scared that the president could spin out of control and abuse its power and that sort of thing, to where we are today? where most people argue that presidents today regularly abuse their authority, whether it was Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan, or more contemporary presidents like Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or um, Barack Obama or certainly Donald Trump, right? How did we get from there to here? Well, remember when we were talking about, well, let me preface this by saying something else. There are lots of different reasons. There are a number of different factors that help us explain why the framers didn't fear the president, but today we do. And one of the first factors may sound a little bit silly when I mentioned it to you just now, but here it is. The framers, to some extent, didn't fear the presidency because the framers automatically assumed that all presidents would be like our first president, George Washington. Because even as the framers were creating Article 2 of the Constitution during the Philadelphia Convention back in 1787, and we didn't have our actual first presidential election under the Constitution until 1789, most of the folks seated in Independence Hall in Philadelphia during that convention, most of them assumed that the first president of the United States was going to be George Washington. Why? Because at that point in American history, George Washington was by far the best known, the most highly respected, and the most beloved person in the United States. Because think about it, even by 1787, George Washington had this huge track record of success, few failures too, but those weren't as well publicized. But he had a huge track record of success in helping to lead the 13 colonies through the American Revolution. They become the 13 states, and he is a key figure in government in the United States in our early history. And he was also the presiding officer at the Philadelphia Convention. So most of the framers thought, oh, hands down, this guy is going to be the first president of the United States. And so here's the thing, right? Washington had this huge reputation, and it was, from everything I've read, a very well-earned reputation for honesty, integrity. Maybe when you went to elementary school, when you were really little, you remember hearing the story told about when George Washington was a kid and how even then young George Washington was so honest and so upstanding that he couldn't tell a lie. And maybe you heard the story about how young George Washington was, playing on his father's farm one day. And for whatever reason, his father was not on the property at the time. And old George, for some reason, got this wild idea, and he cut down one of his father's prized cherry trees. And so, of course, when Dad got home, when Dad got back to the farm and he saw this cherry tree lying on the ground, he was really angry. And he finds young George. And he says, "Hey, do you know what's going on here? Do you know who cut down my cherry tree?" And what the story tells us is that George Washington, the future father of the United States, says, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. It was I who cut down your cherry tree." Well, first of all, if you were told that story by a teacher or somebody when you were a little kid, guess what? It never happened. That story is historical myth. And we had the fundamental untruth of that story be proven to us a number of years ago. There was a team doing an archaeological dig, a team of college students, undergraduate students, and graduate students, all archaeologists. They were doing an archaeological dig on the land where George Washington's father's farm once stood, and they discovered no evidence that cherry trees had ever grown on the farm. So that story never happened. But the reason why that story was first developed was to illustrate a very important point. that Washington was this incredibly honest, highly regarded individual in early America with this huge positive reputation. So it's not surprising that the framers figured, oh, this guy is going to be the first president. Now, why the framers thought that all subsequent presidents would be like him, I don't know. Because as we talked about early on in the semester, the framers were very skeptical regarding human nature in general. They didn't trust most people. They didn't even trust most elite people like themselves. So how they made that connection, I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with the Electoral College. They figured, well, the Electoral College are only going to elect good people to be president. I don't know. But that's part of this. One of the reasons why the framers didn't fear the presidency is because they thought that all presidents would be like George Washington. Kind of strange. But here's the thing. Because the framers didn't fear the presidency, because the framers didn't think that the presidency would spin out of control in a way that Congress could, the framers, as they sat down to create the structure and function of the presidency in Article 2 of the Constitution, didn't sweat the details with the presidency in the same way that they did with Congress in Article 1, right? So remember how I said in Article 1, the framers very carefully specified what Congress could and could not do so that Congress would have enough power to carry out the jobs that it needed to carry out for the good of the country, but it didn't have so much power that it could abuse that authority and threaten the people's freedoms and all that stuff, right? Well, the framers just didn't do that in Article 2. Because the framers didn't fear the presidency spinning out of control, the framers did not attempt to box the president in Article 2. In other words, the framers did not really carefully specify what presidents could and could not do. And if you take a copy of Article 1 of the Constitution dealing with Congress and put it down side by side with a copy of Article 2 dealing with the presidency, what you will note is that Article 2 dealing with the presidency is a lot shorter. It's not as lengthy as Article 1. It's also a lot more vague than Article 1. So the framers did not clearly specify what presidents could and could not do in Article 2. They left presidential authority rather vague. Now, they gave a broad outline of what the president's powers and responsibilities were. They laid out the 5 basic jobs, the 5 basic functions of the presidency, but they didn't fill in a lot of details about what each of those 5 powers and responsibilities actually meant in practice. They didn't sweat the details in Article 2 because they didn't fear an out of control president. So is everybody with me on that so far? Does that make sense? Any questions, comments, problems, etc., about anything that we've said about the presidency so far? We doing all right? If you have a question, open up your mic or put a question in the group chat. Okay, so let's finish the story, right? Because the fact that the framers didn't sweat the details with the presidency in the same way that they did with Congress in Article 1, that explains how we get from there to here. That explains how we get from the framers not fearing the presidency, not fearing that the president could spin out of control, to where we are today, where most Americans believe that the president is by far the most powerful and the most dangerous of the 3 national government branches. It's the framers' fault, because what it says there, if you take a look in point capital B in section 1 of your presidency notes, and I mentioned this a few minutes earlier, modern presidents, and by modern presidents, we mean starting with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s and coming up and including every president since FDR to the present day, modern presidents have dramatically expanded the power of the presidency. So President Trump today is way more powerful than, say, President Herbert Hoover, the president that was the person who was president before FDR in the 1920s. Way more powerful than, say, President McKinley, who was president at the beginning of the 20th century. Presidents starting with FDR and rolling all the way up today to President Trump have dramatically and intentionally increased their levels of power and authority. That's how we got from there to here. But how did they manage to do it? Well, if you take a look at what it says there in point capital B, modern presidents, starting with FDR, have been able to exploit. They have been able to take advantage of that lack of detail in Article 2. Modern presidents figured out, hey, the framers didn't sweat the details with the presidency. The framers didn't specify carefully what presidents could and could not do as part of their 5 basic functions, their 5 basic jobs. And that has given an advantage to modern presidents. And when you go through the last section of the presidency notes, where I go through and talk about each of the 5 main powers of the presidency in some detail, you will see a couple of different examples. There is the chief executive function of the president the executive order power of the president that I talk about in the role of the president as chief executive. And then there is the executive agreement power that I talk about with the role of the president as chief diplomat. Both of those powers, the executive order and the executive agreement, are not mentioned anywhere in the US Constitution. They're not mentioned anywhere in Article 2 or in any other part of the Constitution. So what I'm telling you is that what modern presidents have done to dramatically increase their levels of power and authority is that they have essentially invented new powers for themselves. And they usually get away with it. Why? Because Article 2 does not carefully tell us presidents can do this, but they can't do that. So if a president invents a new power and Congress or the courts or the American people say, hey, Mr. President, you can't do that, that's not talked about in Article 2. The president can very well say, well, sure, Article 2 may not specifically say that I can do this thing, but it also doesn't specifically say that I can't do this thing. And so this lack of detail in Article 2 is the main reason why modern presidents have become so much more powerful. And as I talk about elsewhere in the notes, every president, including and since FDR, has intentionally increased their power, okay? It's not a partisan thing or ideological thing. Both Democrat and Republican presidents both have intentionally sought to increase their power since the 1930s, okay? And that is the main reason why most people today fear the presidency. Most people today think that presidents have become too powerful. But it does also bring us back to that question that I asked you to think about last week, because, you know, can we make the argument, because a number of presidents have tried, including George W. Bush in the days and weeks after the 9/11 attacks back in 2001. Some folks have argued that the world today is so different from the one that the framers lived in back when they were writing our Constitution back in 1787, that the world today is so much more complicated, so much more dangerous, and that if the president is going to be effective, if the president is going to be able to keep the American people safe and secure, then modern presidents really do need to be a lot more powerful than their predecessors were, that the executive branch needs to be way more powerful than Congress or the courts. Now, obviously, that is a very controversial argument. Some people in American society today believe it, but a lot of people don't. So again, think about this. Do you think that it is right and proper and desirable and necessary for presidents today to be a lot more powerful than they used to be? So any questions, comments, problems, complaints about any of that stuff in terms of how we got from there to here in terms of dramatically increasing levels of presidential power and authority? How are we doing with that? We doing all right? Questions or comments? Okay, great. So in the last about 5 minutes or so that we have left together this morning, I did want to highlight one other really important piece of information that I give you in the presidency notes to help you better understand how and why the presidency has evolved over time in the way that it has. And that's in section Roman numeral number 2, because in that section, the first thing I mentioned is something that I talked about a few minutes ago. And that is the fact that, at this point in our history under the Constitution since 1789, we've had 45 different presidents. And, if you've taken American history class, and no doubt you probably have, if you've gone to the school in the US for most of your life, you've taken American history a number of times. You may have taken it in college, but you probably also have taken it in 11th grade and back in 8th grade and 5th grade and 3rd grade. And so you get this stuff a lot, right? And chances are, in these American history classes throughout your educational career, you've talked about a good number of presidents, especially some of the earlier ones in our history. And if you look at the history of American presidents, if you look at all 45 presidents that we've had in the US, then you'll know that we've had some presidents that the consensus from most people is, yeah, these were our best, most successful, most effective presidents, and names like George Washington come to mind, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that sort of thing. These are the names that you hear. So we have a handful of really successful, really effective presidents, and we probably have a whole lot of presidents that are, they were all right, not great, not terrible. They were fine. They passed with a push. But then you also have a few presidents that are considered to be very ineffective, or in cases, very bad presidents, bad for the country. And folks like Richard Nixon, most recently, these names come up, right? But have you ever thought about this question? How do we decide if we are attempting to kind of rate and evaluate American presidents? If we're trying to create a list of all presidents from best to worst in US history, and believe me, there are a lot of those lists out there. If you Google it, you'll find quite a few. But how do we construct those lists? What is the basis of those rankings? What standards do we use? What metric, what system of measurement do we use to figure out which presidents are better, more successful, more effective than others? Well, guess what? There has been a ton of stuff written over the decades about this, about how we evaluate presidential effectiveness. There's this whole literature out there written by political scientists and constitutional historians and journalists and just ordinary people who are fascinated by the presidency. There's this huge literature called the presidential success literature, and I've read most all of it. And I've read most all of it so you don't have to, because guess what? Most of the stuff in the presidential success literature is junk. It's garbage. It's not worth the paper that it's printed on. But there is one factor that pops up again and again and again in some of this presidential success literature that I think really is the most important factor to consider when you're attempting to create a ranked list of presidents from best to worst in terms of effectiveness and that sort of thing. And I talk about that metric in section 2, in Roman numeral number 2. What we see is that the most successful and effective presidents in American history tended to be the ones that have been able to build and maintain high levels of public support. So in other words, the most successful presidents tend to be the ones that are able to generate and maintain the most support from the American people themselves. So more popular presidents tend to get more done and tend to be more effective. Now, at first, that might sound strange. At first, you might think, well, that's weird. What's the connection? Why are more popular presidents more successful? Well, I talk about this in section Roman numeral number 2. And if you think about it, it makes sense that a popular president amongst the American people is going to be able to get more things done in government. Why? Well, remember, even with all the power that a president has today, if a president really wants to get a lot of things done, a lot of things accomplished, to solve problems in society, that sort of thing, the president usually has to work in cooperation with Congress. Why? Because if the president wants to create certain national government laws and policies and programs and that sort of thing, he normally can't do that by himself. He needs Congress, because Congress is the legislative branch. Congress are the folks that make national government laws. The president is just supposed to be enforcing them once Congress makes those laws. And so guess what? If you're a president and you have an agenda, you have certain things that you want to accomplish for the good of the country, but Congress isn't willing to work with you. If Congress isn't willing to cooperate with you to give you the laws and rules and regulations and programs that you need to fulfill your agenda, well, then you're probably not going to be very successful as a president. So how can a president that doesn't enjoy the support of a lot of people in Congress, how does a president still get things done? How does a president who is not liked by Congress convince Congress to do what the president wants them to do? Well, if the president is really popular, if a large percentage of American voters support that president, the president can use that level of public popularity as leverage to essentially convince members of Congress to do what the president wants them to do. Why? Because members of Congress are obsessed with re-election, right? We've talked about this. This influences everything that members of Congress do. So if members of Congress don't want to pass a certain law that a president wants to pass, but that president is really popular, that president can appeal to the American public, appeal to American voters and say, hey, go tell your members of Congress to support the president on this law, to give the president what the president wants. And please, American voters, tell members of Congress that if they do not cooperate with the president, if they do not give the president what the president wants, maybe in the next election, you, the American voter, will not vote for those members of Congress. So you see the connection? That's how and why in the history of the presidency, presidents who are able to build and maintain high levels of public support are able to get more things done, because they are able to use those high levels of public support as leverage to force members of Congress to do things for the president that the members of Congress might not otherwise want to do. And that's a major reason why some presidents in our history have been more successful and effective than others. So does that make sense? Questions or comments about that? Okay, so we are running just a little bit over time, and I apologize for that. Always too much stuff, too much information to try and get in. So remember, the discussion forum post assignment on Congress is due this Wednesday, May 6th at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day grace period. Your discussion forum post on the presidency is due a week from this coming Wednesday. That is May 13th. Again, plus the 3-day grace period. I'll be working on and grading your test number 2 over the next couple of days and posting those grades for you on Canvas. And remember, if you have not yet turned in your copy of test number 2, if you have not yet submitted it to me via Canvas, please, as soon as possible, send me a Canvas message, send me an email. Stop by my virtual student hours this afternoon from 2:30 until 3:30 on Zoom. Let me know what's going on. Let's work out a solution so that you can get test number 2 submitted and move on with being successful in this class. So thanks again for joining me today. If I don't talk to you sooner, I will see you next Monday, same time, same place. We'll talk about any questions you have about the presidency and then preview the notes for our next section, which is the judicial branch, the courts, the folks who are ultimately responsible for enforcing national government laws. Remember, if you need to talk to me about anything, send me a Canvas message, send me an email, stop by my virtual student hours. Remember, you are going to be successful in this class and in life. We are going to all get through this incredibly bizarre period that we are living through because we are not alone. We are all working through this together. Remember, I am here for you. I've got your back. You are not alone. So be safe, be well, take care, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.